April 18, 1943. 18P-38 Lightning fighters lift off from Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, just after dawn. Their twin engines rumble across the runway, carrying drop tanks heavy with fuel. Major John Mitchell leads them south over the Solomon Sea, flying barely 50 feet above the waves. No radio chatter, no formation lights, just the roar of Allison engines and the spray of salt water below. Each pilot knows the target. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of Japan's combined fleet, is flying to Bougainville Island this morning. The Americans know his schedule down to the minute. They know his route. They even know what plane he'll be in. How did 16 months of bitter island warfare suddenly produce this kind of precision? The answer lies not in radar or reconnaissance planes, but in a basement room at Pearl Harbor where cryptologists cracked Japan's naval code and handed the hunters a timetable written by the prey himself. By spring 1943, the Pacific War had already swallowed 2 brutal years. The United States Marines secured Guadalcanal on February 9th, ending a 6-month grinding campaign that cost Japan 38 ships, 638 aircraft, and over 19,000 men. Henderson Field, the airstrip that both sides fought for like starving wolves over a kill, now belonged to the Americans. But victory on one island was like owning a single house in a city the enemy still controlled. Rabaul, Japan's fortress base on New Britain Island, loomed 565 miles northwest, pumping fighters and bombers south every week. The Solomon Islands' chains stretched between them like stepping stones across a violent sea. Who held those islands would control the supply routes to Australia. Could the Allies push forward, or would they stall in the jungle heat while Japan rebuilt its strength? The answer depended partly on what the Japanese would do next, and partly on whether the Americans could read their plans. Deep beneath the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in Honolulu, a cramped basement unit called Station HYPO worked around the clock on that second problem. Commander Joseph Rockefort led a team of cryptologists trying to crack JN-25, the Japanese Navy's operational code. Think of it like trying to solve a crossword puzzle where every clue is written in numbers, and those numbers change meaning every few weeks. JN-25 used roughly 30,000 to 45,000 5-digit number groups. Each group stood for a specific word, phrase, or order. Then the Japanese layered a second code, an additive table, on top of those numbers, scrambling them further. Before Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO could read maybe 10 to 15% of intercepted messages, and only in fragments. By mid-1943, they had pushed that number higher, peeling back enough layers to glimpse Japanese movements. When a coded signal went out from Rabaul on April 13th, listing an inspection schedule for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Station HYPO decrypted it within hours. Yamamoto was not just another officer. He commanded Japan's combined fleet. He had planned the Pearl Harbor strike. His name carried weight across the Pacific, both among his own men and among the Americans who wanted him dead. Now, in April 1943, he planned to visit frontline bases in the Solomon Islands to boost morale after the Guadalcanal defeat. The decrypted message gave his exact itinerary: departure from Rabaul at 6 a.m. on April 18th, arrival at Balhail Airfield near Bougainville at 8 a.m., flying in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber escorted by 6 fighters. It was like receiving the enemy's appointment calendar written in ink. Should the Americans use this intelligence? If they attacked Yamamoto's flight, would Japan realize the code was broken and change their entire system? The decision climbed the chain of command, from Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor to Navy Secretary Frank Knox in Washington, and landed on President Franklin Roosevelt's desk. Roosevelt reportedly gave a simple answer: get Yamamoto. But saying it and doing it were separated by 435 miles of open ocean, the maximum range of American fighters, and the need to make the ambush look like an accident of war rather than a planned assassination based on broken codes. The mission fell to the 339th Fighter Squadron, part of the 347th Fighter Group, stationed at Henderson Field. Only one aircraft in the Pacific Theater could make the trip, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. This twin-engine fighter could carry external fuel tanks and still maintain enough speed to catch a Japanese bomber. But even the P-38 was pushing its limits. The direct route from Guadalcanal to Bougainville measured about 400 miles. Flying straight would put the Lightnings over Japanese-held islands where coast watchers and radar stations could spot them and radio ahead. Instead, planners drew a long, sweeping arc south and west over open water, 600 miles out, 400 miles back, with fuel reserves for combat. It was like driving a car whose gas tank was just barely big enough to reach a destination, knowing you'd have to fight someone when you arrived and still drive home. Could 18 P-38s fly for over 2 hours at wave-top height, arrive exactly on time, and still have enough fuel to engage enemy fighters? Major John W. Mitchell, already a fighter ace, was chosen to lead. Mitchell knew navigation over featureless ocean was the mission's knife edge. A few degrees off course, and they'd missed the intercept entirely. Yamamoto's punctuality was legendary. He would arrive at 8 a.m., not 8:05. Mitchell requested a Navy compass, more accurate than the standard Army model, and had it installed in his cockpit the day before launch. Each P-38G carried one 330-gallon drop tank under one wing and one 165-gallon drop tank under the other. The mismatched tanks put roughly 1,000 pounds more weight on one side of the aircraft, making it awkward but flyable. The fighters also kept their standard armament, one 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns in the nose. 18 pilots were briefed on April 17th. They were told the target was a high-ranking officer, but not all of them knew it was Yamamoto until after the mission. For pilots would break off as the killer flight to engage the bombers. The other 14 would fly top cover, blocking Japanese escort fighters. What could go wrong? Mechanical failure, navigation error, early detection, cloud cover hiding the target, or the Japanese changing Yamamoto's schedule at the last minute. The morning of April 18th began with pre-flight checks in the dark. Pilots climbed into cockpits at 6 a.m., while ground crews topped off fuel tanks and armed the guns. Mitchell's Lightning rolled first, followed by 17 others in two ship elements. 2 aircraft aborted shortly after takeoff due to mechanical trouble, leaving 16. They dropped to 50 feet above the Solomon Sea, low enough that spray from the waves occasionally hit the cockpit glass. Radio silence was absolute. No weather reports. No position updates. Just the rhythmic drone of Allison V. 1710 engines and Mitchell's navigation, checked every few minutes against his watch and compass heading. For 2 hours and 10 minutes, the P-38s flew southwest, then west, then northwest, threading between islands they never saw. At 9:34 a.m. local time, exactly as planned, they turned north toward Bougainville and climbed to intercept altitude. 30 seconds later, the flight spotted 2 Mitsubishi G-4M bombers and 6 Zero escorts, right on schedule, approaching the coast. The hunters had arrived precisely when the prey did, and the prey had no idea anyone was waiting. Lieutenant Rex Barber sat in his P-38 cockpit during the 2-hour flight south, watching his fuel gauges tick down like sand in an hourglass. Every pilot on this mission knew the math. The P-38G carried 410 gallons internally, plus another 495 gallons in the external drop tanks. At cruise power, the Allison engines burned about 70 gallons per hour each. That left almost no margin for error. What if they hit headwinds? What if the interception took longer than planned? What if combat burned extra fuel? Barber and his wingman, First Lieutenant Rex Hine, along with Captain Thomas Lanfear and Lieutenant Besby Holmes, made up the killer flight tasked with shooting down the bombers. The other 12 P-38s, led by Major Mitchell, would handle the Zero escorts. But all 16 pilots shared the same invisible leash, fuel. Think of it like walking a tightrope stretched across a canyon, where the rope gets shorter with every step. You can't stop. You can't slow down. You either make it across or you fall. Some pilots later reported landing back at Henderson Field with their tanks showing less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. They had flown over 1,000 miles round trip, fought a battle, and returned on vapors. Did they think about ditching in the ocean? Absolutely. But they kept the throttle set, trusted Mitchell's navigation, and flew home on discipline and prayer. Interception geometry is unforgiving. Mitchell had to calculate where Yamamoto's flight would be at exactly 9:35 a.m., then position his fighters to arrive at that same point at that same second. The Japanese bombers would be cruising at roughly 180 miles per hour at around 4,500 feet altitude. The P-38s would approach from below and behind, climbing to attack altitude just before visual contact. If Mitchell arrived 5 minutes early, the Japanese would spot them and turn back. If Mitchell arrived 5 minutes late, Yamamoto would already be landing at Balhail. The window was tighter than a rifle sight. Mitchell planned the interception for a coastal area near Empress Augusta Bay, still over water, but close enough to Bougainville that Japanese radar might not distinguish the American fighters from routine air traffic. How do you hit a moving target when both you and the target are invisible to each other until the last moment? You calculate based on known speeds, known departure times, and a whole lot of faith in your compass. Mitchell checked his watch every few minutes during the flight, comparing elapsed time against distance covered. When he turned north toward the interception point at 9:34 a.m., his timing was off by less than 60 seconds. That's like throwing a dart from across a football field and hitting the bullseye on the first try. The P-38 Lightning and the Mitsubishi GE-4M bomber, nicknamed Betty by the Allies, were opposites by design. The P-38 was built for speed and firepower, mounting one Hispano 20mm cannon and 4 Browning .50 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose. No synchronization gear needed. Pilots aimed the whole aircraft like pointing a shotgun. The Betty, by contrast, was built for range at the expense of protection. It carried no armor plating and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Japanese designers wanted maximum range to hit distant targets, so they packed the wings with fuel cells and left off the extra weight. One solid burst into a Betty's wing could ignite the fuel, turning the bomber into a fireball within seconds. Allied pilots called them flying lighters. How fast could a Betty fly? Maximum speed was about 265 miles per hour, but cruise speed sat closer to 180. The P-38 could hit 400 miles per hour in level flight. Could the Betty outrun the Lightning? Not even close. Could it outmaneuver? Also no, the Betty was a heavy bomber, sluggish in turns. The G-4M's only real defense was its escort, the 6 Mitsubishi A6M0s from the 204th Air Group. The Zero was lighter, more agile, and could outturn any American fighter in 1943. But the P-38 pilots had learned a hard lesson: never dogfight a Zero. Use speed. Dive, shoot, climb away. Don't get drawn into a turning contest you'll lose. Admiral Chester Nimitz faced a decision sharper than any sword. Station HYPO had handed him Yamamoto's exact schedule, date, time, route, aircraft type, but using that information carried enormous risk. If the Japanese suspected an ambush based on intelligence rather than luck, they would change their codes immediately. The Allies would go blind across the entire Pacific theater. Everything from submarine deployments to carrier movements to troop. Convoys would vanish behind an unbreakable wall of new encryption. Was killing one admiral worth losing the ability to read enemy communications for months, maybe years? Nimitz consulted with his intelligence chief, Commander Edwin Layton, and both men understood the stakes. They decided the risk was acceptable for 2 reasons. First, Yamamoto was irreplaceable. No other Japanese officer carried his strategic vision and combat experience. Second, they could create a cover story. If questioned, the Allies would claim Australian coast watchers in the jungle had spotted Yamamoto's flight and radioed the alert. It was plausible. Coast watchers did operate throughout the Solomons, hidden on hilltops with binoculars and radios. The story might hold. Nimitz forwarded the mission proposal to Navy Secretary Frank Knox, who took it to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt's reported response was 2 words: get Yamamoto. The order traveled back down the chain to Admiral William Halsey, South Pacific commander, who signed the mission to the 339th Fighter Squadron on April 17th. From code intercept to mission approval took just 4 days. That's like planning a bank heist between Monday and Friday, except the bank is 435 miles away and guarded by expert killers. Lieutenant Takeshi Morisaki led the 6-0 escorts from the 204th Air Group that morning, flying 1,500 feet above and behind Yamamoto's 2 bombers. Morisaki was a seasoned pilot. So were Warrant Officer Kenji Yanagiya, an ace with 7 confirmed kills, and Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka, who had roughly 20 victories. These men were not novices. They flew in 2V formations, 3 zeros on each side, positioned to intercept diving attacks from higher altitude, the standard American tactic. But standard tactics are only useful when you see the enemy coming. The P-38s approached from below and behind, rising out of the ocean glare like sharks breaching the surface. By the time Morisaki's pilots spotted them, the Lightnings were already climbing toward the bombers. How do you defend 2 slow, unarmored targets against 16 faster fighters when you're outnumbered nearly 3-1? You split up. Some Zeros dove to engage the killer flight. Others climbed to block the cover flight. But splitting a 6-plane formation into smaller elements dilutes your defensive strength. Think of it like 6 guards trying to protect 2 prisoners from 16 attackers. You can't be everywhere at once. The Zero pilots fought hard. They shot down 1 P-38 and possibly damaged others. But they couldn't stop the attack. After the mission, the surviving escort pilots were neither punished nor criticized. Japanese commanders knew the truth. 6 fighters couldn't defend 2 bombers against 16 attackers, no matter how skilled the pilots. The escort pilots, however, blamed themselves. Several vowed to shoot down as many Allied planes as possible in revenge. Yanagiya was promoted to Petty Officer Second Class on May 1st, right on schedule, and continued flying combat missions until war's end. Was Operation Vengeance an act of war or a political assassination? The question troubled some American officers, even decades later. Justice John Paul Stevens, then a young Navy intelligence officer, worked on the mission's periphery. Years afterward, he reflected that U.S. planners seemed to debate only tactical concerns. Could they pull it off without revealing the code break, but gave no thought to humanitarian considerations? Does a military leader in uniform, traveling between active combat zones, constitute a legitimate target under the laws of war? Most legal scholars say yes. Yamamoto was commander of the Combined Fleet, a combatant officer engaged in active operations. He wasn't a head of state. He wasn't traveling under a flag of truce. He was moving between military bases in a military aircraft escorted by military fighters. Under international law, that makes him fair game, no different than shooting at an enemy tank or bombing an enemy headquarters. But the premeditated nature of the mission, knowing his exact schedule, planning the interception down to the minute, felt different to some observers. It wasn't a chance encounter. It was a planned execution. Does planning make it assassination? Or is it simply good intelligence used effectively? The debate continues. Some argue targeted killings of military leaders should require higher authorization than ordinary combat decisions. Others say war is war, and eliminating an enemy commander is no different morally than sinking an enemy ship with its captain aboard. The mission planners in 1943 didn't spend much time on philosophy. They had an opportunity to remove Japan's best naval strategist from aboard, and they took it knowing the risks and weighing the potential gains against the possible exposure of their code-breaking advantage. At 9:34 a.m., Major Mitchell led the formation through its final turn, banking northeast toward Bougainville. The P-38s climbed out of the morning haze at around 2,000 feet, throttles pushed forward, engines roaring. The sky ahead looked empty. Blue sky. Green mountains. No Japanese aircraft. Mitchell checked his watch. They were 1 minute early. Had the timing been off? Had Yamamoto changed plans? Then Lieutenant Douglas Canning's voice cracked over the radio, breaking 2 hours of silence. Bogies. 11 o'clock high. Every pilot snapped his head left. There, 5 miles away, and about a mile above them, 2 dark specks trailed by 6 smaller ones. Two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers descending in a gentle glide toward Balale Airfield, escorted by 6 A-6M0 fighters. Right on schedule. Right where Mitchell's navigation said they would be. It was like watching a train arrive at a station when you've memorized a timetable, but this train carried Japan's most important naval officer, and the Americans intended to derail it permanently. Mitchell keyed his radio. "All right, Tom. Go get him." Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dropped their external fuel tanks and dove toward the bombers, accelerating hard. Lieutenant Besby Holmes tried to follow, but his drop tanks wouldn't release. They hung on his wings like anchors. Holmes pulled every release lever, yanked the stick, twisted the aircraft, nothing. His wingman, Lieutenant Ray Hine, stayed with him. That left only two P-38s, Lanphier and Barber, to attack both bombers. Meanwhile, Mitchell's 12 cover fighters climbed higher to engage the 6 Zeros. The mission plan was already coming apart. The Japanese formation saw the P-38s at almost the same moment. The two Betty bombers immediately pushed their noses down, diving for the jungle canopy. Speed was their only defense. The 6 Zeros split. 3 turned to engage Lanphier and Barber, while 3 stayed high to cover the bombers. Lieutenant Takeshi Morisaki, the Zero flight leader, must have realized instantly what was happening. The Americans weren't here by accident. This was a planned interception. How did they know? No time to think about it. Morisaki's wingmen, including ace Kenji Yanagiya, dove toward the attacking P-38s. Lanphier saw the Zeros coming head-on and made a split-second decision. Instead of dodging, he flew straight at them, all guns firing. Think of it like a game of chicken played at 300 miles per hour with cannons. Lanphier's 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns spat tracers across the sky. 1-0. Accounts differ on whether Lanphier actually scored a kill here, veered off, or was hit. The other Zeros flashed past, rolling hard to turn back. Lanphier's aggressive head-on attack scattered the Japanese fighters just long enough for Barber to slip through unnoticed. Barber dropped low, hugging the jungle, chasing the first Betty bomber. The bomber pilot was good. He stayed low, weaving slightly, trying to reach the cover of trees. But the Betty's maximum speed was about 265 miles per hour. Barber's P-38 could hit 400. The distance closed like pulling a rope hand over hand. Barber lined up the shot, nose slightly below the bomber's tail, aiming for the fuselage, and wings. His finger pressed the trigger. All 5 guns fired at once. The recoil shook the P-38. Tracers arced across the gap, punching into the Betty's right wing and fuselage. What happened in the next 15 seconds became one of the most debated controversies in American military history. Barber saw his tracers hit the bomber, watched smoke pour from its engine, and claimed the kill. He momentarily lost sight of the aircraft as he banked hard to avoid collision and overshooting his target. When he looked back, he saw a bomber crashing into the jungle below. That must be the one he hit, he thought. Meanwhile, Lanphier, after his head-on pass against the Zeros, turned back toward the bombers. He later reported seeing a Betty to his right, attacking it from the side, and shooting off its right wing before it crashed into the jungle. 2 pilots. 2 different angles of attack. 1 bomber down. Who shot it? The answer mattered because that bomber carried Admiral Yamamoto. Barber's after-action report stated he attacked the first bomber from behind and saw it crash. Lanphier's report stated he attacked a bomber from the right side and destroyed its wing. Their flight paths put them in different positions at different times. Could both have hit the same aircraft? Could Barber's attack have damaged it enough that Lanphier's follow-up shots finished it? Or did they each hit a different bomber? The second bomber, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Mato Magaki, also went down, crashing into the ocean near shore. Some P-38s from the cover flight attacked it after finishing with the Zeros. The wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber was later found deep in the Bougainville jungle, about 9 miles inland from Moila Point. Search parties reached it the next day. They found Admiral Yamamoto still strapped in his seat, his white-gloved hand gripping his samurai sword, 2 bullet wounds in his body, 1 through his left shoulder blade, 1 through his jaw. He had been killed instantly, or died within seconds. The most influential naval strategist in Japan was dead before his bomber hit the trees. While Yamamoto's bomber spiraled into the jungle, the sky above erupted into a chaotic dogfight. The Zeros attacked everything. Rex Barber turned back toward the coast after watching Yamamoto's bomber crash, searching for the second Betty. He spotted it low over the water, near Moila Point. Besby Holmes and Ray Hine had finally gotten their drop tanks off, and were already engaging it. Holmes raked the bomber's right engine with machine gun fire, producing a white vapor trail, probably coolant or fuel. But Holmes's speed carried him past the target. Barber came in next, firing another burst. His bullets struck the Betty, but debris from the disintegrating bomber flew back and hit his P-38. Metal fragments punched holes in his wings and fuselage. The crippled bomber descended sharply and crash-landed in the water just offshore. Vice Admiral Mado Magaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, survived along with 2 others. They clung to floating wreckage until Japanese boats pulled them from the sea hours later. Ugaki suffered serious injuries but lived. He would return to duty and eventually die in August 1945, piloting a suicide plane toward Okinawa in the final days of the war. But that was 2 years away. Right now, the Zeros were hunting the P-38s like wolves cornering prey. Barber's aircraft took hit after hit, 104 bullet strikes total by later count, though some accounts say 140. Think of it like running through a hailstorm where every piece of hail is a bullet. His wings were shredded. His tail's surfaces had holes. But the P-38 kept flying. That was the Lightning's advantage: 2 engines, redundant systems, and a tough airframe. One engine could fail, and you could still limp home. Barber and Holmes both claimed 0 kills during this melee. Japanese records, however, show no Zeros lost. Either the claims were mistaken in the chaos, or the damaged Zeros made it back to base and weren't officially reported as destroyed. Mitchell's cover. Flight engaged the remaining Zeros higher up, preventing them from overwhelming the killer flight. The dogfight lasted only minutes, but it felt longer, every second stretched thin by adrenaline and fear. Then Mitchell checked his fuel gauges and his watch. Time to leave. The P-38s had been airborne for nearly 3 hours. They still had to fly 435 miles back to Guadalcanal. Mitchell called the break. "Let's get the hell out of here." The Lightnings disengaged, diving for the deck, heading south over the Solomon Sea. The Zeros didn't pursue. Maybe they were low on fuel too. Maybe they stayed to search for survivors. Maybe they knew the mission had already failed. The 2 bombers were down, and with them, Japan's most important admiral. The return flight became a test of nerve and fuel management. Every pilot nursed his throttles, leaning the mixture to stretch every drop of gasoline. Besby Holmes ran so low that he couldn't make Henderson Field. He diverted to the Russell Islands about halfway home and landed with his fuel gauges reading empty. 1 more gallon, and he would have ditched in the ocean. Lieutenant Ray Hine never made it back at all. His P-38 disappeared somewhere over the Solomon Sea. No radio call, no distress signal, just gone. Search planes looked for him the next day, but found nothing. Hine was 23 years old. He became the only American fatality of Operation Vengeance. 15 P-38s landed at Henderson Field between 12:30 and 1 p.m. Some touched down with 1 engine coughing from fuel starvation. One pilot later said his engine quit while taxiing off the runway. As Captain Thomas Lanphier approached the field, he broke radio silence again, his second breach of security that day, and transmitted in the clear: "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." Everyone listening knew what he meant. Intelligence officers on Guadalcanal reportedly went pale. If the Japanese intercepted that transmission, the entire code-breaking secret could unravel. Fortunately, either the Japanese didn't intercept it or they didn't understand the implication. Lanphier landed moments later, 1 engine quitting from fuel starvation as he rolled to a stop. He immediately claimed credit for shooting down Yamamoto. That claim would spark a decades-long controversy among the pilots involved, historians, and researchers. Who actually killed Yamamoto, Barber or Lanfear, became a question argued in books, interviews, official reports, and veterans' reunions until both men died. Back in Bougainville, Japanese search parties headed into the jungle the next morning, April 19th. They followed the smoke column and crash path. The wreckage lay scattered across a hillside about 9 miles inland from the coast. Yamamoto's bomber had hit the trees at high speed, cartwheeling through the jungle before slamming into the ground. The searchers found Admiral Yamamoto still seated upright in his chair, which had been thrown clear of the main wreckage. His white-gloved hand gripped his katana sword. He had 2 bullet wounds, one through his left shoulder blade exiting through his chest, one through his lower jaw. Either wound would have been fatal. He likely died instantly or within seconds, never knowing the aircraft was crashing. The crash itself didn't kill him. Rex Barber's machine gun bullets did. Japanese officers conducted a field cremation ceremony at the crash site, burning Yamamoto's remains according to tradition. His ashes were placed in a wooden box and flown back to Rabaul, then transported to Tokyo aboard the battleship Musashi, Yamamoto's former flagship. Japan kept his death secret for a month, finally announcing it on May 21st. The official story claimed he died in combat during an inspection tour, which was technically true, but gave no details about the ambush or how the Americans knew his schedule. A state funeral followed on June 5, 1943, attended by over 1 million mourners in Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito posthumously promoted Yamamoto to Marshal Admiral, the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Nazi Germany awarded him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords. But awards and ceremonies couldn't change the fact that Japan's best naval strategist was gone, shot down by 16 American fighters who knew exactly where he'd be and exactly when he'd arrive. The news traveled slowly at first. Japanese search teams confirmed Yamamoto's death on April 19th, but Tokyo kept it secret for over a month. Why the delay? Partly to prevent panic among military personnel and the civilian population, and partly to complete arrangements for a proper state funeral. On May 21, 1943, Radio Tokyo finally announced that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been killed in action during an inspection tour of forward positions. The broadcast described his death in vague terms, killed in combat while leading from the front, but gave no details about an ambush or intercepted codes. Japanese newspapers ran front-page tributes. Citizens lined streets to mourn. Navy personnel reportedly wept openly when the news reached their ships. Yamamoto wasn't just another officer. He had been a living symbol of Japan's naval power, the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, the man who dared to challenge American industrial might. His death felt like losing a compass in the middle of a storm. If Yamamoto could be killed, what did that say about Japan's chances of winning the war? Morale among frontline troops and sailors dropped sharply. Vice Admiral Mato Magaki, who survived the bomber crash, wrote in his diary that the loss was incalculable, comparing it to losing an irreplaceable piece on a shogi board. Could anyone fill Yamamoto's shoes? The Japanese Navy's investigation focused on how the Americans knew Yamamoto's schedule. Several theories emerged. Some officers suspected spies or coast watchers had spotted the flight and radioed ahead. This was plausible. Allied coast watcher networks did operate throughout the Solomon Islands, hidden in the jungle with radios and binoculars. Another theory blamed the Army. Yamamoto's itinerary had been transmitted in both Navy codes and Army codes. The Army's cipher was weaker. Perhaps the Americans had broken the Army code, but not the Navy's JN-25 system? This theory gained traction within the Navy. It preserved pride. Our codes are secure, the Army's codes are compromised, and deflected blame away from naval cryptographers. What did the investigation conclude? Officially, poor operational security. Too many people knew Yamamoto's schedule. The flight path was predictable. The timing was too precise. But here's what the investigation did not conclude. That JN-25 was broken. Japanese cryptographers examined the system and found it sound. They believe correctly that breaking JN-25 required massive computational effort, thousands of intercepted messages, and months of work. They did not believe the Americans could do it consistently. They were wrong, but their confidence kept JN 25 in service for the rest of the war. The Allies continued reading Japanese naval communications, extracting ship movements, battle plans, and supply schedules. Station HYPO's gamble had paid off. They killed Yamamoto and kept the code-breaking secret intact, though barely. One more radio slip, like Lanfear's transmission, and the whole operation could have unraveled. Admiral Minaichi Koga replaced Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet on April 21, 1943, just 3 days after Yamamoto's death. Koga was efficient, conservative, and deeply aware he was not Yamamoto. He lacked Yamamoto's charisma and strategic creativity. Where Yamamoto took bold risks, Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, the Midway operation, Koga preferred caution. He reorganized the fleet into carrier task forces modeled after American formations, attempting to copy what was working for the enemy. He planned a major counteroffensive in the Aleutians to dilute American strength, then hoped to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's remaining carriers could deliver a crushing blow. Think of it like a boxer who's been losing on points, trying to land one knockout punch before the final bell. But the punch never came. Japanese losses mounted throughout 1943, the Solomons, the Gilberts, New Guinea. Land-based aircraft were chewed up faster than replacements arrived. Carrier air groups lost experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. By late 1943, Koga shifted to a purely defensive strategy, conserving forces for a last-ditch battle when the Americans pushed toward the Marianas and Philippines. He called it the Z Plan. It was a plan born of desperation, not strength. Koga himself died in March 1944 when his flying boat disappeared in a storm near the Philippines. His briefcase, containing the Z-Plan documents, washed ashore and was recovered by Filipino guerrillas who handed it to American intelligence. The Japanese Navy lost 2 fleet commanders in less than a year, and with them, any hope of reversing the Pacific War's momentum. On Guadalcanal, the returning pilots landed to cheers and immediate debriefings. Intelligence officers wanted every detail. Who shot what? Where did the bombers crash? How many Zeros engaged? Captain Thomas Lanfear reported that after engaging Zeros head-on, he spotted a Betty bomber, attacked it from the right side, and shot off its right wing before it crashed into the jungle. Lieutenant Rex Barber reported attacking a Betty from behind, setting it on fire, and watching it crash. Both pilots claimed to have shot down Yamamoto's bomber. The problem? There was only one bomber carrying Yamamoto, and it crashed in the jungle exactly where both men said they shot down a bomber. Who actually killed Japan's top admiral? The question ignited a controversy that burned for 50 years. Initially, both pilots received half credit for the kill. But as evidence accumulated, Barber's version gained support while Lanfear's story fell apart. Japanese recovery crews found the bomber's right wing lying directly next to the fuselage, still attached by twisted metal, not torn off in flight as Lanfear claimed, but ripped away during the crash. Think of it like a car accident where someone claims they knocked the door off another car, but investigators find the door still hanging by its hinges. The autopsy report on Yamamoto showed bullet wounds entering from behind, consistent with Barber's rear attack, not Lanfear's claimed side attack. A surviving Zero pilot testified he saw Yamamoto's bomber attacked from behind. Every piece of physical evidence pointed to Barber. Why did Lanfear lie? Pride? Ambition? Or did he genuinely believe he shot down a different bomber that he confused with Yamamoto's in the chaos? The dispute poisoned relationships between the pilots for decades. Lanfear promoted his claim aggressively, giving interviews, writing articles, and basking in the glory of the man who shot down Yamamoto. Barber, more reserved by nature, quietly insisted on the truth, but lacked Lanfear's media savvy. In 2003, after both men had died, the U.S. Air Force officially credited Barber with the sole kill of Yamamoto's bomber based on accumulated evidence from crash site investigations, Japanese records, and testimony from other pilots. But official recognition came too late for Barber to enjoy. He died in 2001, still frustrated that Lanfear's false claims had stolen credit for the most important mission of his life. Mitchell, the mission commander whose navigation made the entire operation possible, received less public attention than either Barber or Lanfear, despite arguably being the mission's most critical contributor. How do you hit a target 435 miles away, over open ocean, arriving within 1 minute of the planned time, without GPS or modern navigation tools? Mitchell's skill made that possible, yet his name rarely appears in popular accounts. All pilots who flew the mission received the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest award. Major Mitchell had originally been nominated for the Medal of Honor, but Admiral William Bull, Halsey downgraded it to a Navy Cross, reportedly. Furious over security breaches like Lanfear's radio transmission. Loose lips cost Mitchell the nation's highest military decoration. Strategic impact rippled outward from Yamamoto's death like waves from stone dropped in water. Japan lost its most experienced naval strategist at a critical moment. The war in 1943 was entering a new phase: island-hopping campaigns, carrier battles, submarine warfare, choking supply lines. Yamamoto understood carrier operations better than any Japanese officer. He had studied American industrial capacity, lived in the United States, and knew Japan was racing against a clock it couldn't stop. His replacement, Admiral Koga, lacked that understanding. Koga fought defensively, conserving forces, hoping for one decisive battle that never came. Would Yamamoto have made different choices? Possibly. He might have taken bolder risks, attempting to bleed American forces through aggressive carrier raids. Or he might have recognized earlier that Japan could win and advised seeking a negotiated peace. We'll never know. What we do know is that Japan's naval effectiveness declined steadily after April 1943. The Philippine Sea Turkey Shoot in June 1944 decimated Japan's carrier air groups. Leyte Gulf in October 1944 shattered the surface fleet. By 1945, the combined fleet existed mostly as scattered remnants hiding in harbors, conserving fuel, waiting for an invasion that would be met with suicidal desperation. Could Japan have won if Yamamoto lived? Almost certainly not. American industrial superiority was overwhelming. But could Yamamoto have made Japan's defeat less catastrophic or negotiated better surrender terms? That's a harder question. Morale, strategy, and leadership matter, especially when you're losing. Yamamoto's death removed the one Japanese officer who might have convinced the emperor and military leadership to seek peace before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the Allies, Operation Vengeance proved that targeted killings based on intelligence could succeed. The mission validated code-breaking as a war-winning capability. It demonstrated that long-range fighter interceptions were feasible with proper planning and navigation. And it provided a massive morale boost. 16 American fighters had reached deep into Japanese-controlled territory, killed the enemy's top admiral, and returned home. If Japan's best could be killed, Japan could be beaten. The mission also raised uncomfortable ethical questions that remain relevant today. Does wartime justify assassination? What are the limits of targeted killing? When does military necessity override humanitarian concerns? Think of it like pulling a single thread from a tapestry. Removing one leader can unravel an entire organization. But does that make it right? Modern debates over drone strikes, targeted operations, and eliminating enemy commanders echo the same tensions that some officers felt in 1943. Operation Vengeance became a template. Intelligence identifies a high-value target, special operations eliminate them, strategic advantage shifts. The mission succeeded militarily, but its ethical implications continue to provoke discussion among historians, legal scholars, and military professionals decades later. Yamamoto's death was both a triumph of intelligence and a reminder that war reduces human lives to targets on a map. 18P-38 Lightnings lifted off from Henderson Field that April morning, carrying fuel tanks, ammunition, and a secret pulled from encrypted radio signals. They returned 15 strong, minus one pilot lost to the sea, and one aircraft that landed short of home. In between, they killed the architect of Pearl Harbor and proved that intelligence could be as deadly as any bomb. What did Operation Vengeance really accomplish? It removed one brilliant strategist from a war Japan was already losing, but the psychological blow echoed far beyond tactics and fleet movements. Yamamoto's death told both sides something profound. No one was unreachable, no matter how carefully protected or how far behind enemy lines. Does that revelation make warfare more efficient or simply more ruthless? The answer depends on whether you value precision over restraint. Operation Vengeance became a template for modern targeted operations. Identify the target through intelligence, strike surgically, minimize collateral damage. It's a strategy used today with drones and satellites instead of P-38s and Morse code intercepts, but the underlying principle remains the same. Remove the king, and the board changes, even if the game continues. The mission succeeded because of three things: codebreakers who cracked an enemy cipher, navigators who threaded a needle across 435 miles of ocean, and pilots who flew a fuel starvation tightrope to reach their target. Think of it like a chain where every link had to hold. One weak connection, and the whole operation collapses. Station HYPO's cryptologists never fired a shot, but killed an admiral. Major Mitchell never saw the target, but delivered his team within 60 seconds of perfection. Lieutenant Barber pulled the trigger, but 16 pilots made it possible. That's how war works when intelligence and execution align. Yamamoto understood this better than most. He'd studied American industry, lived in Washington, and warned his government that Japan couldn't win a long war. His death proved him right, not because he was killed, but because the Americans possessed the resources, the intelligence networks, and the operational skill to kill him when they chose. In the end, Operation Vengeance wasn't revenge. It was a demonstration that the Pacific War had already shifted, and no amount of tactical brilliance could reverse the tide once the Allies learned to read Japan's secrets and act on them with precision. The mission succeeded militarily, but its deeper lesson was about the changing nature of warfare itself. Knowledge became as powerful as firepower, and distance offered no sanctuary when the enemy could see through your codes and across your horizons.